Speaking of music, since its inception in 1989, listening to Triple J's Hottest 100 Music Countdown has become an Australia Day tradition at barbecues around the nation.
The annual countdown of the most popular songs of the year is decided by listeners who vote in the world's biggest online music poll. Now, sports economist Liam Lenten is the co-author of a discussion paper about the Hottest 100, and he reckons he's got the formula that can help predict the winner. He joins us in the studio now. Are you ruining the Triple J's Hottest 100 surprise by trying to find a way to predict the winner?
Hi, Paul and Melissa. Not at all. On the contrary, we've just tried to crunch some numbers on this, Geordie McKenzie from University of Sydney and myself, and we start out from the premise that songs that resonate with the music listening public will tend to do very well no matter how you define demand, right? So they'll tend to do well in a poll like the Hottest 100 and also ARIA chart success. And what we find in the way that we measure it is that there's around about a 40% correlation, right? And what we try to do is go about explaining some of that remaining 60%. But even still, using these models, and while we've got some really nice results that we think are useful, that itself can only explain a small proportion of what remains.
So your formula looks like something out of Good Will Hunting. The maths up on the board, but tell us a couple of the things that you found.
Okay, so we looked for advantages from the point of view of doing well in the Hottest 100 relative to chart success. So thinking about the types of songs that Triple J fans would have a high propensity to vote for. We tried to identify certain characteristics about the song or the artist, and we identified that, for example, alphabetical ordering of the song is quite an advantage.
Yeah. So that's when you go to click on and
so that's
choose
got to do with the voting system, and if senior programmers at Triple J really wanted to eliminate that sort of thing, they might consider possible policy changes, but then again they might not be so worried about it. But other things that are much more obvious include exposure. So if you get more airplay, that'll be an advantage. We couldn't quite measure that, but one way to get it was to count a song that was on an album that was feature album at some time during the year. Touring presence is also an advantage, and a simple way of getting at that was to look at artists that were on the bill at the big day out. So a couple of those things. One factor that we identified as a liability is if the song was a cover version of another song.
That turns people off.
Yeah, well, you think of Triple J listeners as being kind of ahead of the curve, right? They want to be listening to newer, emerging stuff rather than rehashed old stuff. So that was a result that didn't surprise us in the least.
Now, there's often a lot of controversy about what song ends up at number one. There's been some particular years where there's been a few raised eyebrows. The one that springs to mind for me was the Pretty Fly for a White Guy came up 1 year right at the top and people were scratching their heads. Is there any way that this system can be manipulated or perhaps unfairly influenced so that it's not really representative of what Triple J listeners like?
I wouldn't have thought so, although one factor that kind of borders on that is that time of the year when the song is getting its maximum airplay. So in that particular year, Come Out and Play by Offspring was getting its peak airplay at around about that time between, let's say, September and November, just before the listeners are going onto their computers and logging on and voting. So it's fresh on the minds. So it's not manipulation, it just happens to be, to a certain extent, luck of the draw.
Can you give us your top 3 or top 5 off the top of your head?
I'm not going to give you a top 3, but I will identify 2. Coming back to what I said at the beginning about the correlation with ARIA chart success, the 2 songs that are eligible for voting that finished finished high up in the year-end charts from last year were Gaudier's Someone That I Used to Know with Kimbra, and also Foster the People's Pumped Up Kicks. And I'm not going to suggest that they'll do a Quinella, so to speak, but you can expect both of them to feature prominently come the pointy end of the countdown.
Yeah, it's amazing you can't bet on it.
Surely you can somewhere. You've given someone an idea.
Yeah, maybe on the subcontinent.
Liam Lenten, thank you very much for taking us through the numbers behind the Triple J Hottest 100.
Thanks once again for having me.